He was too weak to stand, her hands trembling around a needle by a dead hearth when the cabin door creaked open and a stranger stepped through the snowstorm without a word. He laid his coat over her shoulders like he'd done it 1,000 times. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind moaned through the trees like a widow keening for her dead, a sound Emma Whitlow had grown used to, though never comfortable with. Her cabin, no more than a handful of pine logs fitted together by her late husband's hands, stood like a stubborn tooth on the slope of a barren ridge. The roof sagged with early snow, its edges dripping ice like the fingers of something waiting to let go. Inside, Emma moved slowly, not because she was old, but because she had learned there was no need to hurry when no one was waiting on the other end of a task. She kept her world ordered, a tin cup always hung by the basin, 3 spoons in a cracked blue jar, her late husband's coat still by the door, though the man who wore it had long turned to dust. She'd spoken to it once, months back, when the silence of the house had pressed too tight. Just a whisper. "It's just me now." Since then, even that had felt like indulgence. Words were expensive when you were the only one around to spend them. She ate little. Cornbread crumbled in goat's milk when she had it. When the snow came earlier than expected, it buried the narrow trail down the ridge, and with it, her last hope of reaching the town before supplies ran dry. She marked the days on the wall beside the hearth with the tip of a sewing needle. Faint scratches no one would ever see, a quiet record of endurance. Each mark was a vow. She hadn't been erased yet. At night, the cold climbed in through the cracks, curled around her ankles like a cat with bad intentions. She wrapped herself in the patchwork quilt she had started before Samuel died, the fabric stiff with age, some patches already fraying. Every square was a memory. A student's apron, her mother's shawl, the sleeve of her wedding dress. She never let the fire go completely out, but its embers glowed like old pride, dim but not dead. Sometimes, when she lay awake, she imagined a knock on the door. She didn't believe in fairy tales, not anymore, but some part of her still held out for something nameless. Not rescue, not romance, just a face that would look at her and recognize something, anything, worth remembering. But the snow kept falling, and the silence was loyal, until it wasn't. The wind bit harder now, its howl scraping across the ridge like a warning. The snow had thickened into a curtain, and Wade Callahan tugged his hat low as he pressed forward through the white, his horse grumbling beneath him. The land had changed. Less fence, more wilderness. It suited him. He wasn't looking for roads anymore, just silence, just distance. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 4 days, not since he passed a burned-out homestead where half a barn still stood like a charred rib. That was his sister's place, or had been. Fire had come quick and mean, leaving her with little more than a scorched Bible and 2 shaken daughters. Wade gave them his house in Sheridan and took only his horse, his saddlebag, and enough coin to disappear. His coat was stitched with silver buttons, a gift from a man he'd once saved in Cheyenne, and they gleamed faintly now, catching what little light filtered through the storm. The horse stopped just shy of a small clearing and wouldn't move. Its ears twitched. Wade scanned the trees and saw it. Smoke that wasn't smoke, the ghost of it. And then the outline of a cabin slumped into the hillside, barely holding shape against the snow. He didn't knock. The door creaked open under his gloved hand, revealing a room dim with cold. It smelled of damp ash and old wool. In the corner, a woman sat, or rather, stayed upright by sheer will. Her dress hung loose around her shoulders. She looked up, not startled, just resigned, as if she'd expected death and been mildly surprised to see a man instead. He didn't ask her name, just removed his coat and laid it over her shoulders like he was folding away a secret. She didn't protest. Her lips were cracked, her skin sallow, but her eyes still watched him like she was trying to decide if he was real. Wade had nothing to offer but silence and something hot from his pack. He lit a small fire from the coals, using what was left of her kindling. She tried to sit up straighter, failed. He didn't help her, not out of cruelty, but because he sensed help would humiliate her more than hunger ever had. Outside, the snow fell heavier, the world closing in. Inside, neither of them spoke, but something had shifted. The air no longer felt abandoned, and Wade didn't leave. Not that night, not the next. There was something in her still, a kind of defiant stillness that anchored him harder than any homestead ever had. The cabin no longer smelled of silence. It smelled of yeast and cracked wheat, and the faint burn of crust caught too long against the iron oven wall. Emma hadn't made bread in nearly a year, not since her last neighbor moved away without saying goodbye. But now she made it every few days, quietly, methodically, as if obeying a recipe written in memory instead of ink. Wade never asked for it, never praised it, but she noticed the way he breathed deeper when he stepped through the door, the way he lingered near the stove without looking at it, the way his hands stayed still a little longer when the smell filled the room. She didn't ask questions either, but she watched. When his fingers cracked from cold and rope burn, she brought out her books, her teacher's editions, worn and softened at the edges like river stones. Dickens, Whitman, Melville, not because they were relevant anymore, but because they had been hers. She read aloud, not with grandeur, but with rhythm, with a schoolteacher's cadence, letting the words smooth the air. Sometimes Wade closed his eyes, sometimes he didn't. Either way, he listened like a man who had forgotten what stories could do. The snow kept falling, but something warmer stirred between them. Not heat, not touch, but a presence. He never crossed the line she hadn't drawn. Never lingered in her gaze too long, never stepped past the invisible threshold of what her pride could allow. Still, she noticed the way he fixed the window latch before she could ask, or how he carved a spoon from scrap wood when one of hers snapped in two. His hands were rough, but they moved with care, like he understood that in this house, every object held a history. She began a new quilt, each square a timestamp, 31 years of teaching, stitched in cotton scraps from dresses she remembered children wearing, a square for Samuel, her husband, from the flannel shirt he wore the day they built the porch. A square for each letter she'd written to town asking for supplies, never answered, but never forgotten. Then, without a word, she stitched one final square, and into its center, she sewed the silver button. Wade saw it one evening when the lamplight hit just right. His brow furrowed, not in anger, but in a kind of stunned recognition. "It fell off your coat," she said, keeping her voice even. "But I wanted to keep it, just in case." "In case of what?" he asked softly. "In case you left," she replied. "And I needed to remember someone once stayed." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was sacred. Wade didn't reach for her. He didn't speak again. He simply took her hand, cold, calloused, and impossibly steady, and held it like it was the only thing in the world he trusted not to break. The snow receded like a curtain drawn back from the stage of their lives, revealing a land that hadn't died after all, just slept deeply beneath the weight of winter. Spring didn't arrive with thunder or fanfare. It arrived shyly in blushes. The dogwood tree outside Emma's porch unfurled petals the color of washed-out coral, and the grass beneath the ridge turned soft with green shoots that hadn't dared rise in years. Emma stood on the porch with her hands clasped loosely. a faded blue ribbon tied into her hair like a secret from her girlhood. The dress she wore was cream-colored, worn at the seams but clean, pressed, carefully chosen. She hadn't touched it since the day she buried Samuel. She didn't wear it to feel young again. She wore it because it was hers, and she was no longer afraid to be seen. Wade came down the path with a slow gait, his coat catching the breeze, its silver buttons catching the light. All but one. The space where it should have been wasn't patched. He had left it bare, like a missing word in a sentence that didn't need finishing. He didn't say much as he approached. He rarely did. But the way he looked at her, direct, steady, was the same way men look at land they've fought for and earned. They walked into town together once, just to remind the world they still existed. Past the general store, past the blacksmith, past the dry goods counter where women used to lower their voices when Emma entered. Now, no one whispered. No one dared. Not after Wade had spoken. Quiet as a man stating a fact that wasn't up for debate. She's the only teacher I ever learned from. They were married beneath the dogwood. No guests, no Bible verses, no ring bearer with shining shoes. Just wind, sun, and the steady creak of the rocking chair on the porch behind them. Emma didn't ask for a veil. She asked for truth. And Wade gave it to her, not in words, but in the way he held her hand during the silence, in the way he stood still when the breeze threatened to pull the moment apart. Later, she unfolded the quilt over their bed. It stretched wide across the mattress, heavy with memory and thread. The final square rested at the center, the silver button gleaming like a promise made without speaking. "You never saved me," she said, smoothing the edges. "I know," Wade answered. "You were just waiting to be seen." And that was enough, more than enough.